I live in a cabin by the sea. How quaint, says one observer. How majestic, says another passerby. All are envious. I can say that it is truly a good thing to live in such a cabin by the sea. To hear the ocean waves rustling just before sleep. To smell the salt permeating the air. To see the endless skyline of the horizon stretching out to eternity. Right out your bedroom window. There's nothing quite like it. Before the accident, I'd never banked on achieving such a distant dream. That was perhaps the one good thing to come out of it. A sole beacon of light in a torrential storm of shit and darkness. But of light, well, every light must go out, or so I should think. Whether it be a candle, a flashlight, a star, or the promise of youth, everything that shines must consume itself, must die, in keeping with the natural order. In some sense, then, even as the light within me now just flickering, as if fighting against a strong, insuperable wind. Let me start from the beginning. It all began shortly after my daughter was born. I'm a journalist by profession who moonlights as a fiction writer in my spare time, where I'm able to cultivate my true passion in life. But passion doesn't pay the bills, and writing as a hired pen does put food on the table. As such, at the time I was chasing down a new story that had come across my desk. The story concerned a fabled Native American tribe that were direct descendants of the first European groups that came over on the ice bridge and populated the Americas long before the modern European lineages and Columbus, as you surely were mistaken to believe was the first, had ever mastered the Atlantic. I won't use the real name of the tribe for reasons that you will come to understand in time, but for now, we'll simply call it the Mogake Indian tribe. The story goes that through dint of some great secrecy, the tribe has managed to survive to this day wholly outside of the white man's history books. Despite this, some supposed characteristics of the tribe and its rituals have been passed by word of mouth among many other tribes. In fact, it was considered that their language, for instance, was very much similar to the dialect of the Hopi Indians. It was this connection, in keeping with their nature as the root of the family tree of native peoples in the Americas, that led to the story coming across my desk. The connection is the following. There was an editor, a few floors above me, a very important voice at the journal who had been at Yale as a student during the tenure of the great linguist Edward Sapir. He had become enamored with the work of the professor, and what would come to be known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, an idea that he was a devotee to for the rest of his life, come what may in the face of counter-evidence. He'd had something like a mania for the concept, seeing in it some kind of unifying principle which was the answer to all of humanity's ills and woes in this age of division. Now I'll explain briefly just what this hypothesis entails for those uninitiated, and hope that if you've come this far with me, you'll continue to follow the bouncing ball. Benjamin Britten, was a fire safety engineer by profession who moonlighted as a linguist. And as it turns out, he was a student of Sapire's who developed the hypothesis that it is our language which shapes our perception of the world and our worldview. One of the exciting results of this hypothesis has been Worth's own study of the Hopi Indians and their language, which, it turns out, lacks certain characteristics of modern world languages, but which perhaps causes them to more naturally intuit the concepts of modern science, such as relativity of time and space. Scientific facts that have taken the modern European centuries to embrace, perhaps were all along merely forgotten truths of our youth, like the pure creation of the child's imagination, so raw, so in touch with the naked substrate of reality, that in later life has been wholly forgotten, extinguished, and lost. The question had been raised whether it was our Newtonian language that had led to the discovery of classical mechanics and our intuitive sense of it, and whether, had our language been structured differently, much like these more primitive tribes, whether we would have lit upon a physics and an intuitive understanding of the world entirely different than what we are now accustomed to in the West. It was hypothesized by this eccentric editor of ours that if the Mogake could be traced and uncovered, if more could be revealed of their secrets, that an entirely new way of experiencing the world might be unveiled via the mystic forces of linguistic relativity, say. One which perhaps would unify the people who have been so split by the fall of Babel. And so this, in brief, was how I found myself driving through the backwoods of the Northeast towards a reservation where I had good intel, some descendants of the Hopi Indians with particularly interesting views of the Mogake question were residing. That was when the accident happened. To be honest, I don't remember much of what happened. Such a strange state of affairs when an event which has so shaped, molded, and transformed the course of one's life becomes so shrouded, so faded into obscurity that one can hardly tell if there ever was such an event which had occurred. Or perhaps things had always been this way. A single thread of unity tying things from some early state of primeval suffering to the present state of scientifically advanced suffering, all a result of some horrible genesis long ago. I don't mean to confuse or obfuscate the picture. It's only, this was long my experience of it, which I cannot be unfaithful to in the retelling, for it did shape much of the way in which I reacted to things from the most banal occurrences to the most urgent of emergencies. It was as if there was a piece of me missing, something which was cut out and thrown away on that day of the accident. Keep this in mind. In any case, after the accident, there was a lawsuit. And with how I came out the other side of the accident, with 2 crushed legs, a broken pelvis, needless to say, we were awarded a hefty sum by the insurance company to alleviate Well, my suffering, my medical costs. The sum, while likely to seem meager to many successful and wealthy types, it was sufficient for my wife and I's financial circumstances to be life-changing. Don't get me wrong, while no amount of material wealth can make up for the fact that I'll likely never walk independently again, this small windfall is what eventually allowed us to follow our dreams, to buy that little plot of land, with that cabin overlooking the sea. What's more could a striving writer want than a cabin deck situated on the edge of a cliff to sit on with his typewriter as he gazes out over the organic forms of the waves from on high? What dreams may come before his mind's eye as the delicate foams grow and collapse, as the tides seep in and out over the endless white sands? I ask you. Besides, the changes to my physical routine have not been as bad as one might think. I get around just fine in my wheelchair. Occasionally I can make rounds about the yard using a walker, so long as I pace myself. But other times, the pain, which I'm told may never fully fade, becomes so excruciating that I can barely leave my bed for a spell of weeks at a time. I could never get a clear layman's explanation as to why this had happened to me. But when people would ask, I'd just tell them it was nerve damage. It was during one of those spells that the events which are the subject of this current recollection occurred. This spell of suffering, in particular, was one of the worst that I can remember. During the first stretch of it, I remained completely bound to my bed, rarely eating, unable even to aid my wife in the caring for our baby girl. In a sense, my wife had, during these brief times, 2 infants to care for, to attempt to feed. I being one of them, to rouse us from our deep slumbers, to soothe our cries and our pangs. But on the tail end of it, I was finally able to sit up in bed, at least, to watch our daughter, to mix a bottle, and to feed her myself, so long as the crib was pulled in tight to the bedside. Now, I should also mention that the location of our cabin was very remote from the nearest town. It was about a 50-minute drive to the nearest grocery store, for instance. Our cabin was only reachable via a network of back roads and state seasonal roads, which were approximately 30 minutes off the main highway that brought you into town. My wife, at the time, worked as a hospice nurse for a few families in town. This was the nearest town to where we lived, one in a suburb of the closest city, about twice as far away. Therefore, she was often traveling, staying away sometimes for a few days or more at a time, especially after my accident. When I was available then to take care of the baby while she made up for our lacking finances, it seemed the length and frequency of her travels and sojourns had increased dramatically of late, a matter of some tension between us at the time. So, Once I was past the worst of my sufferings and able to marginally get around and sit up in bed for hours at a time unaided, she had come to me and told me she was urgently needed by one of these families' elderly patients that she cared for. She told me that she would be away for 4 days near the city. It's about a 4-hour round trip. In some sense, this came as a relief to me at the time. I didn't blame her for this, but when I would go through one of my spells in which I was of no use at all to her, in which she would have to care for me and an infant, think about it, double the trouble. She would go through a spell of morose anger, in which the smallest wrong word or wrong action on my part might cause her to fly into a rage. Don't take me the wrong way. She wasn't a violent woman. But even to this day, she has a tongue as sharp as a sword, and she can cut you very deeply. I digress. I shouldn't talk of such things when they only bring back the most painful of musings, of questions, of possibilities and regrets. On the day in question, my wife was busy about the house all morning, preparing containers with meals I could warm up, many bottles filled with the right amount of powdered formula for me to add water to for the baby. She would never leave me alone with the child after the accident without first setting up everything perfectly. Extra wipes and diapers near to the bed, scented bags for wrapping up the diapers, an empty waistband to throw them into, not one but 2 charged cell phones on which I could reach her in case of emergency, and so on. I still remember kissing her cheek gently after reminding her that she was about to leave without saying goodbye. She looked at me with an annoyed expression at first, but as always, she gradually melted, and defeated, she moped over to the bedside and presented her rosy cheek to be pressed upon by my thin, pale lips, which sometimes seemed to drain the very life and color from those cheeks. When I heard the car door shut, the engine turn over, and the crunch of gravel fade, I knew I was alone now. It was just me and the baby. Just as quickly as she was gone, the menacing force of silence set in. That deadly golem that was solitude began to rise from the clay itself. I was now truly alone for what would be the longest period I had been since the accident. My plan had been to get much writing done. An often unspoken part of the agreement when we had purchased this land was that I would, pursue my dream of becoming a fiction writer. That I would finally put down all of my excuses and hang-ups and write the great American novel. My wife indulged in this fanciful vision of our future as much as I did, and we both, it seemed, somehow naively thought that a change of setting, such as living in a cabin by the sea, would make me a better writer, a more inspired novelist, a more motivated scribbler. But sadly, at this point in time, as I listened to the last vanishing sounds of the car drifting away, and indeed after the accident in general, I had been suffering duly from a terrible bout of writer's block, the likes of which no Hemingway, no Fitzgerald had ever had the terrible and hellish misfortune of knowing, despite whatever other challenges they may have faced in their lives. I felt my cross to bear the heaviest of them all. In brief, I was truly damned, without knowing, or at least not having the recollection of the source of my sins. Nevertheless, I had it in my mind that I would be following a rigorous writing schedule during the absence of my wife, that upon her return, this pale cripple would triumphantly present her with at least the bare rudiments and skeleton of a manuscript, one the likes of which would truly shock and amaze her sensibilities. But, as with all great plans that a man can make, it appears that God was laughing at me, for without me being able to tell exactly why, my daughter had gotten it into her head that now was the best time to become more fussy than usual, or perhaps even more so than ever before. My fingers continually moved to the typewriter and then pulled back away amid the din, the terrible noise. I'd reach over and pick her up, feed her a bottle, and rock her until she was on the verge of sleep. But just as soon as I'd put her down, I swear she'd start hollering louder than ever, as if I'd done absolutely nothing to meet her demands in the interim. And therefore, again, my fingertips would walk across the bed towards the laptop and across that smooth plastic case. They would touch the keys, playing upon them, but not press them down. And then occasionally they would press them down, but then hit the backspace key just as quickly. I tortured myself like this for hours on the first day before I went to desperate measures. Now this is the part I've purposely left out up until now. It's something that at the time my wife had only the smallest inkling of, but no full conception of the true nature of it, of course. You see, after the accident, and let's be honest, before the accident and to this day, I was and am a raging closet alcoholic. How could this escape my wife's notice, you may ask? And I agree with this sentiment, with what the question implies for most cases of this sort. But my case was different. My wife knew that I drank too much, alright, but over the years I'd managed to cleverly hide just how much and how often it was, and most essentially, how much of a hindrance it was and had been to my day-to-day functioning. For instance, she didn't realize that it had a lot to do with me not having moved on past the beginning stages of my career as a journalist. How much my bloodshot eyes and sleepy afternoons at the office had stalwarted my progress and led me to fly under the radar of the management, to be passed over for promotions and other opportunities. So, gradually, and thus perhaps so insidiously, had this habit crept and grown like vines around my legs, which creep to eventually consume me. That to those around me, the slight gradations of change were likely unnoticeable. Like a colleague who gains only a pound a month and passes without notice, whereas when his family sees him after a long lapse, he appears to them a circus fat man to their eyes. And thus had my habit grown to the epic proportions of a great ball and chain professionally, like that of those prisoners in the cartoons, except mine was quite invisible to those who mattered most to me, who were also those from whom I would do my damnedest to hide it. Now, if I gave you one guess to what are the desperate measures that you fancy I was pressed in this situation, that's right. It wasn't long before I'd leaned down, reaching under the bed for something unseen, and then the bottle sat beside the laptop on the bed. My eyes moved between three targets: the blank word processor on the screen, my daughter finally asleep in the crib, the bottle. Indeed, my orbs verily bounced between the three so incessantly that I nearly became dizzy and drizzly. Just a taste. This is what I thought, thinking of my wife's reaction were she to walk back into this room at this very moment, observing how long, or rather how short of a time, I'd lasted in her absence, without some liquid courage and nourishment, for verily I felt I was starving for it. The empty word processor on the screen, merely a metaphor for my empty belly. I just need to moisten my lips, I said, reaching out for the bottle as the man in the desert does for the mirage which has hopelessly sidetracked his journey. Just a taste. Just a taste. I muttered as I poured the amber liquid into a small rocks glass I'd also retrieved from under the bed. After the first sip, I was in a sauna in the depths of the winter cold. The warmth dripped over me and ate through the center of me. I could feel myself falling backwards, but just a little, as if my muscles were all relaxing by just a certain degree, causing my torso to press back into the pillows by a greater margin, hardly perceptible. I was truly feeling myself at home in my own skin for the first time that day. Nothing could be further from my mind than those damn Mogaki Indians. My ill-fated meeting with those Hoppies, or the accident. But at the same time, nothing could be closer, for the relaxation not only of my body but of my inhibitions can at times result in a sort of shaking loose of the cobwebs that bind the creative apparatus. I tell you, even Isaac Newton had been fond of a glass of wine to help him write the Principia. I'm not making this up. Likewise, in my case, the most natural subject for my great American novel, the subject that had been eluding me all these months, had been right in front of my face the whole time. The Mogakis? That's it. What a mystery. What intrigue. I held up the bottle and watched it glimmer in the rays of sunlight that poked in through the windows at this time. Damn you, I love you, I told the bottle so tenderly, so thankfully, and so honestly. After that, I was off to the races. I'd never known my fingers could move so fast, so unconsciously before, as if my mind could be completely suspended of attention towards what was being written, and yet the subject would still unfold as if part of a natural and unstoppable organic process such as gravity or lightning. By nightfall of the first day, I could barely remember what I'd written during my most productive hours, however. I could damn well read the word count, which sat at just shy of 10,000 words. My God. It's the most I've ever written in a day. Hallelujah. How about it? Maybe she should go stay with the patients more often, I said to myself. Now, I wasn't a total bastard, and this last thought I certainly did feel a strong sense of shame for. Quickly banishing the remembrance of it from my mind's eye, I remember carefully drinking enough water to ensure I wouldn't be too hungover, that I'd be able to wake up should the baby need to feed. I carefully took care of my duties before dimming the lights and laying back in bed. I gradually faded into a warm oblivion as I pondered why I'd put writing this topic off for so long before now. So much time had been wasted. That day, I'd crafted the beginnings of a noirish thriller. Let me begin. There was a hard-boiled journalist who is seeking something mysterious from his pursuit of the Mogake Indian tribe. Perhaps the key to immortality. Some witch doctor's spell to incapacitate his enemies? Let me tell you, I hadn't gotten that far yet. I didn't know the essential details. But what was crystal clear was that I'd need to do more research on the tribe myself if I expected the words to continue to flow the way that they had that day. The setup, the introductions, even writing a twist ending. In my experience, that was the easy part. It was the slog of the middle I wasn't ready for. I decided that the next day would be dedicated to doing a deep dive on the topic, putting my journalistic internet sleuthing talents to use. For once. I remember fading and fading ever so gradually as I obsessed over the work that was to come, without knowing exactly when it occurred. I was then unconscious. That night, strange and powerful dreams overwhelmed me. For once, it seemed, even the baby was overtaken with sleep, as I myself did not wake once from this powerful slumber. And when I did awake, she was cooing, happy as a peach. The previous day felt like a fog, and the haze of the dreams hung over me that morning. I dreamt of something moving through the woods and the brush outside. Something that had come in from the ocean, had arisen from the dark tides of the night on those foamy shores. It had lurked in the darkness all around the woods and the clearing where the cabin was situated. It had given me a really off feeling. However, the feeling was ill-fated. Destiny only let it linger into a moist background, like an overcasting mist. But at the same time, it was countermeasured by the excitement I felt over this new work, this new beginnings, which had come so effortlessly. I imagined a future where each day my fingers would flow and glide so smoothly as if the story were already something predetermined, something I'd known previously, but simply forgotten. It wasn't like before I'd forced myself to rise from the bed to grab a pot of coffee, to take care of the baby, and then to get back to work to pick up right where I'd left off, as if there never was a break at all. As I sat down over a cup of black coffee to begin the day's research, my mind was endlessly racing. Where should I start? Among 1,000 possible search queries, I seemed to be hitting the same wall I had faced over the months previous of writer's block. But why? Why were the wheels so greased yesterday, and now all the gears seizing up this morning? But, my mind returned to the image of the bottle glistening in the sunlight. But it's far too early. I haven't even finished my coffee. Though I could simply spruce it up a bit, a little sprucing up never hurt anyone. If only I had some Baileys. That would be a right Irish coffee. But I'll simply improvise. And the next thing I knew, a stream of caramel was flowing into the black as tar cup of joe. Before I knew it, I was back in the zone again. All the creative juices coursing through my veins. It was this little bit of sprucing up that gave me the courage to do it. The courage to make that singular call. The call that perhaps decided and sealed the fate of me and my family. The call that is the reason I sit here writing this now. Now, to put it delicately, what I had found was somewhat alarming even to myself at first. It was the social media page of one of the hobbies I was supposed to have met that day, the day of the accident. There was even, perhaps naively so, a cell phone number listed on this social media page among the various photos, comments, and musings posted. The vision of this page brought a sudden flashback to my mind. Me driving down the highway, getting off the exit onto some back roads. Though it was of something I had no memory of, I knew what it was, what it signified immediately. It was the night of the accident. I made a conscious effort to banish it from my memory, lest it halt the flow of productive creativity, this vein of pure generative gold I had felt I had tapped into, as if I held in my hand the Philosopher's Stone. As I held the phone in my hand and began dialing the numbers, similar flashbacks began to plague me. Visions of me driving at various points intermittently on the way to the Hopi reservation. But besides the obvious actions I was currently taking, I couldn't help but become agitated and nervous as to why. Why, after all this time, were such remembrances unintentionally returning? That which I thought was erased, dispelled, evaporated, forever, lost from the universe, had come back. On my first try ringing the number, I received no answer, and no voicemail system seemed to be set up. But the second time, within the first couple of rings, I heard a clicking noise, and then the sound of someone breathing on the other end. A dry, low voice inquired tersely, "Who is it?" It took me a moment to put my thoughts together, during which time the voice repeated itself, this time sounding rather more agitated. "Hello? Sorry to bother you. I'm a journalist. I work in New York. I used to work in the city. We've spoken once previously about a project I'm working on." I went on to explain why I hadn't been able to keep our appointment this last time. The voice on the other end sounded unsure, mistrustful, as if they weren't sure that I was telling the truth, or perhaps they hadn't truly remembered our previous discussion, our previous plans to meet. The entire thing seemed exquisitely puzzling. And yet, my goal was secured. By the end of the call, they'd agreed to have one of their tribesmen stop by my cabin. They'd made me aware that he was traveling in the area for other reasons, by chance, or by my good fortune. I left them with my address and phone number, which they promised to forward to their kinsman, who they assured me would agree to be interviewed for my current project, which I explained delved into the roots of their history and family lineages. After I hung up, a strange feeling lingered in the back of my mind. Something seemed so off about this personality on the other end of the line. It wasn't just that they were a stranger, that possibly mistrusted me and my intentions. There was something more mysterious to it, but I couldn't even explain what it was that bothered me to begin with. My mind refused to identify it or put a name to it. After I finished my first cup of turbo, the feeling seemed to fade, and I, being the man that I was, refused to dwell on it any further. The crippling pain that had been simmering deep in my mended bones seemed to melt away as the dull buzz of the alcohol set in. I'd been told the tribesmen would likely be stopping by the next day, so until then, I was going to do my all to get another 10,000 words in, even if it killed me. As I began the grueling process, all I could think about was my wife. I wish I could say that the driving force was to make her proud, showing her that I'd finally gotten back on my feet since the accident. However, in reality, it was more so revenge. The cutting words she'd uttered over the months since I'd become bedridden, as she'd been forced to take care of me rather than care for and spend time with her infant, as her resentment had grown. Granted, during this time of postpartum depression, the words loser, useless, and crippled, the phrase "you're not even a man anymore," continually echoed in my mind. I was going to show her just what type of man I was. Upon her return, I would present to her this manuscript as Joseph Smith himself must have presented the golden plates of Mormonism to his wife. In brief, I would be triumphant against the feminine cruelty I had suffered these past months. My hobbled legs and ego would rise from the ashes as the phoenix born anew. As my fingers thundered faster and faster, the novel began to take its clever shape. Now, the central character, this hybrid form of journalist and private investigator with a mysterious past, he was hiding something, not only from the damsel, but from himself as well. That was it. It was going to be a psychological thriller, where everything seems one way, but in reality is the mirror image of what it appears at first, the exact chiral reflection. As the plot thickened and became dense, I found myself getting more and more drawn into the mystery, as if I weren't even the source of it, but a reader getting sucked into the words of another. I really couldn't stand the suspense. I just had to know what would happen next, and this phenomenon only drove me deeper into my concentrated efforts, which had become by now a full-blown obsession. I just couldn't take my fingers away from the keyboard, try as I may, but as was inevitable, by the time I'd reached 7,000 words for the day, I began to lose steam. My vision was growing blurry from staring at the screen. My hands ached, and I could feel the pangs of early onset carpal tunnel syndrome setting in. I looked over at the baby, who was staring at me with the purest look of curiosity at my actions. I suddenly realized that she'd barely made a sound that day, probably the quietest day since the moment of her birth. A sudden panic overwhelmed me as the paranoid thoughts of what might be, or could be, wrong besieged me at all angles. I leaned over and picked her up, checking her diaper, searching her whole body for possible harm, but I found none. She was perfectly healthy and seemingly happy as I looked down at her, and she cooed that gentlest sound up at me in return, meeting my gaze with that perfectly loving smile. I fed her another bottle and held her to my chest till I'd begun to grow weary. When she passed out, I laid her back in the crib and pulled it closer to the bedside. It was then I'd noticed the 2-liter bottle had been emptied over the course of 2 days. It was no cause for panic, though. I remembered that our grocer would be dropping off some bags at the house next day, that I'd slipped him a $100 bill last time and told him he'd get another $20 on top of his cost for each delivery, that he was willing to hide a bottle in the bottom of the basket. Given my state of relative disability, I had no other way of sneaking booze into the house, and any other bottle that my hand had reached for, coming through the channel of my wife, it would be kept track of. The sinking level of the liquor would be noticed, and I knew eventually she'd start complaining again, as she had in the past, about my, let's say, little habit. And so I had only to make it through the rest of the night to weather this minor storm in the desert, and come morning, or at the latest the afternoon, I'd have another bottle in hand, well before I would be expecting my most esteemed guest the next day. The man who would help lend a singular realism and faithfulness, the sweet cherry of delight to my tale of darkest mystery. As I watched my daughter toss and turn and then become still, save the rhythmic breathing motions of her chest, I began to doze, and then gradually nodded off as the title for my novel occurred to me in that state where one foot is through the door of sleep. I again suffered paroxysms of nightmarish torture, the fear so real as I had never felt it before. Something had arisen from the dark, foamy ocean sand. It crept through the darkness with horrible constancy. It climbed the rocky precipice which led to my cabin, to my door, and to the very room in which I slept, even to the baby. I awoke to a crack of thunder. I lay in bed completely drenched in a cold sweat, my eyes searching the darkness frantically, in one of those rare moments where it requires more than a few seconds to remember where exactly it is that I lay soaked in wonder and fear. I could hear the raindrops beating against the roof in a constant pitter-patter. It was pouring out. I hadn't looked at the forecast all day. I had no pre-knowledge of this storm, which seemed to be brewing. When I looked down, the only light which softly lit the room was the computer monitor. As my vision came into focus, I saw a little red blinking light on the screen. The battery would soon die, despite my observation of the power cord trailing off the bed. Power must be out. It must be the storm. My hand frantically shot out towards the laptop. I pressed the save button numerous times before the screen went completely black, not remembering exactly how I'd fallen asleep or when. But I was sure my novel would be safe for the time being. It was then that I recalled what had occurred to me right before I drifted off to sleep. The novel would be called Ulalume, after the poem. I wasn't sure exactly why this choice was made by my unconscious muse, but I couldn't fight it. And as I recalled the words of that poem by Poe, which wafted up in bits and pieces from memory, I became entranced, mesmerized by the haunting words which lit my imagination with a gothic tint, as of candelabra in a dark castle of stone and crimson curtains. The leaves, they were crisped and sere, I repeated to myself. in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. These last words brought back the faded and ashen embers of the dream I'd awoken from, of the ghoul-haunted nightmare which had shaken me to the very core, and caused shivers to run down my spine in the remembrance of the dark, dark place I inhabited, where even screams would not be heard for miles, nothing but the crashing of the waves upon the rocks below the precipice to drown out cries of mortal terror. Amidst this sudden recognition of a title which caused the condensation of an atmosphere that would surround and envelope the whole narrative, other threads began to take shape and run their course in my mind, growing, evolving, dying, and arising anew in some strange process of natural selection, taking place wholly in my imagination, which at the moment consisted of pure, shifting, transforming, primeval, generative stuff, like a fertilized germplasm in some otherworldly morphogenetic field, a magnetic fluid under the impulse of hidden gyrating forces, and so forth, a seething ocean teeming with organic life and ephemeral forms that rose from the depths of the darkest regions, old, primitive creatures emerging into a new world, their monstrous bulk and shiny gelatinous surfaces, with infinitely numerous tendrils to tear our souls out through the horror of our eyes. In a word, my protagonist, whose name had only now emerged from the tip of my tongue as Jonathan Gannon, he was searching for some mysterious and heretofore forbidden knowledge of the Mogakis, while at the same time running from something in his own past, as I'd put it down before. There were shadows following him, pursuing him through his travels across the country. At the same time, there was the threat of the resistance of some unknown group of natives who were onto his game, who besieged him at all points with sabotage and assassination attempts. And then there was the love interest, the damsel he had intersected with on his quest for this holy grail of the unknowable. Were her intentions pure? Or was there some other game afoot? Was she a spy? Would she double-cross him? Or did she know something more profound about this mysterious force the Mogaki protected with utter secrecy? These questions, along with a million possible directions of the narrative, all began to take shape in my mind simultaneously, an experience like none other I had lived through. And slowly, my eyes drooped, my lids sagged, and on the verge of sleep, these simulations grew even more animated and fantastic. It was the knock at the door that brought me back from this virtual cliff's edge of sleep. It was the knock on the door that instantly frightened me into a sitting position, for I could think of no other earthly reason why there should have been one. I sat for a few minutes in waiting, unsure if my ears had merely played a cruel trick upon me during my vulnerable state in the interface of waking life and the world of slumber. I was lying prone and vulnerable, and perhaps the illusory forces of this world, which like to play tricks on us, like to cause to hallucinate, or to see optically what isn't there. Perhaps it had been merely one of these sort of events, I reasoned to myself, secretly praying that silence would reign and prevail. All I could hear for some time was the continued pitter-patter of the rain upon the roof, as before, in noise I'd nearly grown deaf to up to that point. What happened next nearly killed me on the spot, as my heart leapt into my throat upon the crack of thunder that pierced the room and lit up with a complementary token of lightning. Damn! Perhaps it was only the wind, perhaps some nearby bush or tree branch was tapping upon one of the walls. But just as I began to relax back into my cool pillow, ready to laugh at the blind and stupid fear which I'd reacted to these seemingly natural processes, Just as my eyes began to droop again, I heard it again. An exact repeat replica of the previous sound, except this time in my state of clear alertness. I knew it was unmistakable. It was someone entreating at my door. Someone was rapping at my door. Again, my heart nearly skipped a beat. I reasoned, who the hell would be out and abroad on a night like this? Or think to visit another's house? To ask for a cup of sugar? If it's one of my distant neighbors, well, this is quite unacceptable. In fact, this is outrageous. But then again, what if it's my wife? What if she came back due to an emergency? What if she couldn't find her key, had simply lost it? I can't leave her out there in the torrential downpour. With this last suggestion, my eye quickly leapt to the cell phone, which was, unfortunately, laying down on the polar opposite side of the bed, near my lately much useless feet. I'd felt the pain growing for some time now as I laid awake in thought, staring as a dull ache. It had slowly crept up on me. Now it was emanating like a spider web throughout my limbs and core. The thought of giving up, even to check out the window, seemed a near impossible task, and one more terrifying than I felt up to. But I must do something, right? I said to myself. I can't just leave someone out there knocking all night long. How long would they continue before giving up? What if they don't give up? What if they assume no one is home and try to gain entry in a fit of desperation, or something worse than that? I must think about the baby foremost. A cold wave of terror rushed over me. As I began to lift myself up into a sitting position, the words bubbled up into my mind from the abyss of memory. Said I, surely there is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, what thereat is, and this mystery explore. And then, something of the lost Lenore. My mind began frantically making these associations. Again, it occurred to me that it really could be my wife out there, stuck out in the cold and wet, likely catching her death. In all probability, it was the most rational belief to have in this moment. Yet fear and paranoia are more powerful than rationality, I dare say. Even on its best day, reason is still a featherweight in comparison to those heavy hitters. And so despite my growing sobriety, which clawed its way into this realm hand in hand with my agonizing pain, I lifted myself up enough to crawl to the edge of my bed, grab my phone. This was a first step. In each instant, I wasn't sure that I would be able to go further. I could put an end to all of this by merely going back to sleep, pretending I never heard anything, I said to myself. In that dreadful moment, the quiet of the house was again ripped asunder, this time by a knock more urgent, more powerful and rapid than before, as if in answer to my cowardly fabrications, my fearful longings to crawl back into bed, like an insect scurrying under a rock. When my phone lit up, I scanned the room with the one light presented by it. The baby was sleeping soundly. Nothing else was to be seen, except that I noticed the low battery signal blinking on this phone too, the second phone I had left downstairs the previous day. I would have to cross the threshold of the door, which was currently being entreated at so urgently, and perchance risk being seen through one of the uncurtained windows. It only occurred to me now how terribly irresponsible it was of us not to curtain all of our windows. Yet When you live in such isolation, such security measures sometimes pass notice until I now learned the occasion that it was too late. The while I searched the darkness for my walker, I continually despised myself for not having installed some security cameras, some floodlights, and reinforced bolts on all the doors and windows, yet, alas, I was now powerless to defend my home country against invasion. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." "Sure," I told myself half-heartedly, as my fingers gripped the rails of my walker and I slowly began moving forward through the darkness towards the hallway. A left turn out of the bedroom, and I'd only a few more steps, rife with dull pain, to the top of the stairs. However, as I searched the darkness, scanning with my eyes, I could only just make out the front door on which someone had been knocking, but the windows in the outer world were nothing more than shadowy forms. I slowly began my downward descent into what sort of hell I knew not, by placing my walker down one step at a time with one hand, and bracing myself on the railing with the other. Naturally, the terror I felt sent tingling sensations down my spine, making my feet feel rubbery as if they were halfway inclined to turn 180 degrees, tear the ligaments and tendons out of themselves, just to begin carrying me in the opposite direction from that I was moving in. When I'd reached the halfway point, a loud crack of thunder rended the air, freezing me in my steps, and in the same moment, I saw a brilliant flash of lightning which lit up the entire floor area of the house. In that instant, I could see clearly the door, the windows, and the spot of ground just outside the door. And in that window, obscuring my view of the outside, was a hooded face, staring directly up at me. I lurched forward, losing the grip on my walker and sending it somersaulting down the stairs. I careened on one foot, losing the railing from my hand in an attempt to grab the walker, which had already plummeted away from me, despite the fact that it was already clearly too late. I found myself balancing on the tiptoes of my right foot, on the very edge of the step on which I stood. I maintained myself in this frozen posture that seemed to defy gravity for what seemed to me a very long time, although I'm sure that everything happened instantaneously, and not as I remember, with the gracefulness of a ballet dance. Next thing I knew, I was crashing down the stairs, head over feet, until I landed flat, smacking my head against the hardwood floor. In that last instant, before my mind went out like a light, one last flash of lightning revealed to me the moving doorknob as the latch seemed to give way. After that, the world went dark. When I awoke, the world flashed into being via a blast of blinding white light. My head was pounding beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. But this inconvenience was nothing compared to my sudden realization that the sun was blazing in through the windows, that it was morning time, and that I'd slept away from the baby all night, comatose, deaf to any cries she might have made for her daddy. I quickly sat up, flailing around as my limbs and core struggled desperately to coordinate themselves. My walker was lying just a few feet away, and I managed to grab it, set it upright, and use it as a lever to pull myself up off the floor into a standing position. But before I turned for the stairs, the door caught my eye. It was very subtly cracked open. It was not quite latched. I couldn't remember if I'd simply left it that way the previous day. But when the previous night's events returned to me with sudden force, I felt a horrible sinking feeling. Whoever it was that had been knocking, they could be somewhere in my cabin. The fear of this possibility left me just as quickly as it came as I thought of my daughter up in the bedroom. I was up the stairs in a heartbeat. Faster did I fly up those stairs, probably than any day even before the accident. To my great relief, there she lay in the crib, sleeping. I watched the rhythmic movements of her chest, which confirmed to me that she was breathing and unscathed. I collapsed onto the bed beside her crib, panting and utterly exhausted, for that comatose sleep of the previous night had brought with it no serenity or restfulness. But not long did I rest before the plague of memory brought back before my mind's eye the unlatched door, the midnight knocker, and the consilience of 1,000 other foreboding events. It was then I decided to make the call. After plugging my cell phone into the charger, I fired it up and dialed the number which I remembered by heart from my early days as a hired pen. During those days at the paper, I'd made use of a private investigator who called himself Detective Donovan. I was never clear on if he'd been in the force or if it was just some kind of nickname that had stuck with him, but he sure had that way about him that police officers have. I'd done him numerous favors in the past, and he'd returned them. We had a trust between us that the years without keeping in touch hadn't broken. I'd once paid him a large sum to take care of a little problem I was facing, but that's not what I was calling him about, no. I wanted to see if he wouldn't mind stopping down to have a look around the place, to let me know his analysis of this little incident last night. It was always good with that sort of thing. Even if he refused to help, I know he'd at the very least agree to be a sounding board that would serve to ease my mind as to the state of affairs at this cabin of mine. Hello? I heard his deep, raspy voice bark into the phone. Hi, Donovan. It's me. Oh yeah. Hey you. He was always a perpetual ball breaker. How have you been, Donovan? It's been a long time. Oh yeah? Not long enough. But I've been okay. Hanging in there. Same shit, different day. Every day. And yourself? Did you finally write that great American novel you were always bragging about? About that. I'm actually out at the cabin doing some writing. My wife, she had to go away for work. It's just me and the baby, and you know how I have such trouble getting around after the accident. Well, something happened last night I wanted to pick your brain about. I ended up describing to him in minute detail the events leading up to the situation last night, as well as how I found things this morning. He kept quiet the entire time, not saying much. At first I wasn't sure if I'd merely been boring him, but at the end of this he sounded genuinely concerned and quite interested in the case. In particular, I noticed his breathing had quickened when I described my phone call with the native from the Hopi reservation, and how one of the tribesmen in the area was supposed to have stopped by the cabin today. He'd even grunted a few times during this part of the story, but had refused to speak up when I had questioned the significance to him. He agreed to stop by later in the day, but couldn't give me a precise hour. He was busy with multiple other cases at the time, and this was one for old time's sake. No charge, he had said. He'd suggested that catching up might not be a bad thing after all, hinting that he might have had something he'd been itching to contact me about, something rather important by the sounds of it. His voice had only shown a dull sort of urgency during the suggestion that we might talk about old times. My impression was that he was doing his all to imply that there was some balance between us that needed to be settled, though I couldn't at the time imagine what that might be. I agreed that he should stop by as soon as he could and that no hour was too late. I left it at that. When another knock thundered through the cabin, this time I didn't get that horrifying sinking feeling. I knew that at this particular knock, it was innocuous, signaling only the bi-weekly grocery delivery from the nearest town. For the first time since the previous night, I felt some relief. I knew that in the bottom of the basket, I would find another bottle. That sweet nectar of the gods, that balm of Gilead. And at the bottom of the bottle somewhere, I was certain, was a breakout novel. A true classic of literature that might withstand the test of time. My great American novel. When I'd gone down to pick up the groceries, I made sure to first peek out the window to ensure that it was only what I suspected to be out there. Thank God, it was the first or perhaps the second relief I'd felt since the previous night's events. I opened the door and began lugging the bags inside, balancing the weight on my walker. When I returned for the customary basket, which typically held preserves and some of the more delicate items packaged in glass jars, I reached in and searched around, confirming what lay in the bottom of it, next to the other sealed containers. It was my Myuu's in there. I lifted the basket with some vigor, only half noticing the dirt beneath it at first. But on second blush, I saw that there was some kind of strange symbol dug into the earth which it had covered. I long stared at the symbol, moving my head from side to side in confusion as I attempted to orient my vision to the alien symbol, which I slowly concluded I had never seen before. It was during this state of confusion that I felt it. It started as a lightheadedness, easily mistakable for minor hypoglycemia, say. But the tremors started, in my fingers and then in my hands, like a man shivering in the frozen Arctic climes. Only it was quite warm out this morning. That was when the fear hit me. Like a burning sensation, it ran down my spine, leaving me in fear that the skin along that imagined trail would be emulsified, peeling away and sloughing off onto the ground. And then the brain pain set in, a sharp stabbing pain that emanated out into clusters. In this state of excruciating pain and terror, yet I continued to stare at the symbol, perhaps with greater intensity. I just couldn't peel my eyes away, try as I might. I felt somewhat like a deer in the headlights, who senses that it's the end. This is imminent, but it is still caught in such a state of shock that it can do nothing to prevent it. If only its legs would carry it a few more feet over into the next lane, it might live. But that's not going to happen, is it? Likewise, I had the sudden sensation that some primeval force was about to plow right through me, perhaps eviscerate me and disintegrate or atomize what remained, leaving a mere cloud of dust where once a confused man in a state of shock had stood. Eventually, I managed to let out a shrill scream, upon which time the spell appeared at least temporarily weakened. I quickly swiped that basket through the dirt, back and forth at least several times until the symbol had been smeared into an unrecognizable pile of dirt. It took me some time to recover as I stood trembling over the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from that inanimate spot which had moments ago possessed such vile life, such warped potentials. I couldn't stop my body, my whole frame from shaking as I grabbed the basket and retreated back into the house like some terrified mole back into its hole. Once inside the kitchen, I quickly set about putting the groceries away to prevent their spoilage. When it came time to rummage through the basket, My hand arose with the bottle, which it quickly set up on the table. The dawn's light that poked in through that window seemed to light the bottle iridescently, creating an aura of great splendor around it, like it were some ancient relic full of jewels that some primitive peoples might worship. Thus did it appeal to me in that moment in particular, given the state of mortal terror that I had recovered from just a few moments before. My hand so tentatively, ever so tentatively, reached out towards it in a manner filled with hesitation. 1,000 fantastic thrills passed through my being in those shining moments. As some mimetic passion filled my mouth, I began to salivate. My taste buds grew and dilated, my nasal passages with the boundless stinging of the aromas of the bourbon. But then, hesitation. I thought about my daughter upstairs, my daughter who would need me throughout the day which was now so young, so terribly young, with so many seconds, minutes, and hours to pass before I would meet with a decent hour to start imbibing. But in the end, the better angels of my nature, they did not prevail. Within seconds, I had the rocks glass clinking on the counter, clinking with ice cubes. Those ice cubes, they snapped, they crackled and popped, as the lukewarm whiskey poured over them in all its fantastic, shimmering amber glory. A precious topaz, I thought. I drank greedily and deeply of it. After I'd gone upstairs to tend to the baby, to feed her, change her soiled diaper, and entertain her for a bit, I put her down and decided to head out for a walk around the grounds to clear my mind. This was an action strictly forbidden when my wife was home, to spend time out of doors while the baby lay in her crib. But as a man, I knew that she was perfectly safe in that crib. My wife had these silly preconceptions that anything might happen. I knew that, should she need anything, I could very well hear her cries emitting through the window to the bedroom, which I had left open for this express purpose. I had thought of everything, as well as to let the morning breeze carry some fresh air and aromas of nature into the room for the benefit of our daughter's health. I hope that if you are a man such as myself, and in particular, a man of action, that you would understand my way of thinking on these matters. With a fresh glass in hand, I grabbed my walker, which featured a cup holder on one handle, which was the reason that I had chosen this particular walker out of all of those available, and went out into the grass, the dirt trails, and the garden that composed the grounds of this clearing in the woods, on the face of the cliff, over the sea. The warmth of the day began setting into my bones as I did my rounds, giving me a fuzzy, wonderful feeling that started in my belly, owing in no appreciable amount to the small quantity of whiskey which currently sloshed around inside. The inspirations began to crawl at first, then to walk. Eventually, my imagination was full in spirit, sprinting. That day's string of words and inspirations flowed through my mind like some unstoppable torrent. I knew exactly where the story was going. I knew exactly what Jonathan Gannon would encounter, the strange, haunting symbols that could take full possession of the mind once entered in through the eyes and recorded there. As these imaginings began to take shape in what would be their final forms, I began to feel somewhat thankful for that strange aberration in the dirt this morning, and my seemingly uncanny reaction to it. It had now led to the development of the central theme and climax of my story. As I became lost in thought, I found my feet carrying me further and further along the path, until my cabin was out of sight, until I'd entered into the foliage of the woods. but little did I take note of this at the time. The woods on this morning seemed a magical and enchanted place, one which only served to fuel the creative transports I experienced, this splendid and fruitful bender I was on. I continued on until the shadows seemed to change. The heat of the morning had decidedly dispelled, and the overall air of the environs surrounding me, the chirping of the insects and so forth, gave the impression that it was well past the afternoon. I suddenly emerged upon a crag as I stepped out past the tree line. I hadn't been paying attention at all to where my feet were carrying me. I found myself jutting out over thin air upon a thin cantilever of rock, which threatened to dislodge from the cliff's face at any moment. As I stared down, I saw the waves crashing against the rocks, what seemed fathomless depths below me.
I watched helplessly as my walker in my rocks glass tumbled down the cliff face, smashing numerous jagged rocks on a hopeless somersault into the abyss. I could feel my feet losing their perch, my balance wavering. I began to shuffle my feet in an effort to pedal backwards, but the waters below appeared to be approaching me at a precipitate rate, as if I were already in the midst of a free fall to a most certain death. By some Herculean effort, I managed to throw my center of mass backwards despite having little traction on that wet crag of rock. My mind began to replay over and over the images of my walker tumbling out of reach, tumbling away from me and into the foamy depths below. It would have been so easy, I thought to myself. In reality, I was terrified, but not of the slippery perch per se. It was terror at the idea that I might purposely launch myself into that sounding sea at any moment. That some strange aberration, like that which had occurred this morning, might fully consume my will and force me into this final act of self-defacement, that is, self-erasure. Tears began to flow from my eyes as the strange reality of the situation set in. Something is wrong with me, I thought. Something must be very wrong with me. Something is definitely off. But what? What is it in my inner being that is malfunctioning completely, unbeknownst to me? The situation would be similar to one who feels a general sense of being hindered in life, unable to smoothly carry out the basic tasks required, whilst only upon gazing into a mirror they understand that their arms are nearly cut off, dangling by threads. Thus encumbranceed was I in trying to understand myself in my current psychological state. After hobbling around for some time in the depths of these ruminations, I discovered a thick fallen branch which could serve as a fair walking stick to get me back to the cabin. I began stumbling as quickly as I possibly could, falling forward onto my knees several times in my attempts to make up time, the realization of how long I had been away from the baby only now fully sinking in. The branches and thorns clawed and tore my pajama pants as I struggled through the brush, deviating from the well-established dirt paths in my desperation, tripping over roots and branches, clawing tooth and nail through this overgrowth of brush. As I burst through the tree line into the sinking afternoon sunlight, drenched with perspiration, I noticed at once the gray sedan which sat in the driveway on the side of the cabin. "Is that you, Donovan? Well, old boy, you're a sight for sore eyes, old friend." I began stumbling towards the cabin, half conscious of my appearance, my legs cut and bloody, me holding a thick branch for my stability, my breath likely reeking of a now stale bourbon smell. I could anticipate how the conversation would start. Donovan looking me up and down, asking if I'd started early today, me answering that it was only the phenols or tannins, whatever, that I drink it for. They were supposed to extend life, and are the very breast milk of creativity. I could just see him now, still looking me up and down, totally unimpressed in any way, shape, or form with my appearance. Yeah, whatever, I could already hear him saying so disinterestedly. So dismissive was he towards my banter in the past. This man, he was all business. And in my present predicament, this would be a duly positive thing. I found myself moving across the field at a precipitate rate, but as I drew closer to the cabin, I observed that Mr. Donovan was not simply idling in the vehicle waiting for my appearance, and I didn't observe him milling about the side of the house either, but instead, he was simply absent from the scene. To my dismay, the door to the cabin appeared to be open again, though I was sure that I myself had closed it and locked it before I had ventured off upon the grounds. As I looked up at what should have been the open window to the bedroom, where the baby lay in her crib, I observed that it had now been shut. That was it. That was when I dropped my walking stick. That was when I ran into the house, or did the best that I could, to be considered a sprint. Into the door, I immediately noticed the place was in complete disarray. It looked as if the whole cabin had been tossed, as it were, as if someone had been looking for something. But this was only an afterthought as I flew up the stairs, dragging myself up the banister with my shoulder strength. As I darted into the bedroom, the most unearthly terror struck into the very womb of my chest as I stared at a wide open and empty crib. The room began to spin as I entered. The second detail I observed was the absence of my laptop from the bed. But why? I thought in a haze of confusion. When I reached the center of the room, I was almost overwhelmed as the tears of confusion and rage began to well up in my eyes, blinding me. I felt on the verge of a collapse onto the floor in a dead faint as my hyperventilation reached a new peak. How is it possible? I screamed at the top of my lungs, tearing at my hair. Where is my baby, Donovan? Where is my baby? I wailed, my words dissolving into a storm of hysterical bursting cries. As I descended into the pit of a complete mental breakdown, it was something I saw out of the corner of my eye that prevented me from going into a free fall. My line of sight was drawn towards the window. From there I observed something moving across the field. I crossed the room quickly and opened the window, leaning out of it to get a better view. It appeared to be an old woman moving quickly in what could be described as either a hurried trot or even a run. I saw the white hair flowing out behind her. She was adorned in some kind of long robes. It wasn't long before she was at the tree line where she paused for a moment, and in turning, I observed what from a distance appeared to be an elderly native woman, and what she bore in her arms was a bundle of blankets, which she carried in the manner of an infant. I shouted across the field something at her, but before I could finish yelling, before I had the chance to close my mouth, she had disappeared into the trees. My eyes grew wide as the realization of what was occurring sunk in. "Donovan!" I screamed, now louder than before, as I began running from the room and down the stairs. "Donovan! Help! Help! They have my baby! Donovan! Where the hell are you, Donovan?" As I emerged into the air of dusk, I look around me, to the dark tree line, to the empty field and the empty car. I ran around the back of the house, shouting for him, my voice already growing hoarse, the energy sapping from my body as exhaustion set into my disabled legs. "Donovan!" I cried again as I rounded the back of the cabin. The fire pit was lit. There was something burning, but no one visible even to the edge of the cliff. As I approached the fire pit, I noticed something strange, some kind of plastic object melting into a fiery sludge. It was my laptop. I sat in a stunned state, staring at it melt away for a moment when my mind suddenly took flight. It was my novel about the Mogakes. They didn't want their secrets out. They didn't want words written about them. Much in the way other tribes refuse photographs, I would have been stealing their souls with the representation. That was the last thing I remember thinking before the fire exploded into my face and I was sent hurtling onto my back, partly in fright, partly to escape the ball of flame that had singed my face. I think I only blacked out for a few moments, for when I awoke, the sky had not yet faded completely into darkness. I found myself only perhaps 10 feet from the face of the cliff. I found myself crawling towards the edge, but without willing myself to do so. It was an out-of-body experience, as if I was watching myself from above, unable to prevent what was about to occur. I already felt the feeling of being slung into thin air, the feeling of having no perch beneath me, and then of flying faster and faster than one could imagine into a terminal velocity, a final swan dive into the afterlife, should there be one waiting for me. Only question, will my soul go up or down? As I peered over the edge, the end to the mystery of where I should find my old acquaintance came upon me quicker and in a mode more painful than I had imagined. At the bottom of the cliff face, Donovan lay, his body having been dashed upon the rocks, bloodied beyond recognition. The beautiful feathers of the arrow which protruded from his skull waved in the wind tenderly with a softness. "The Mogake," I hissed, as I struggled against the ground, struggled to keep from throwing myself over that same edge, to prevent myself from finding my final resting place there next to Donovan. And it was in that moment that it all came back to me. It all came back to me in an unbelievable rush. I was driving on those back roads again, on my way to the reservation, to my interview with the Hopi. So strange was it that every detail seemed exact, not like some half-remembered dream, but the actual reality repeating itself again, as if some eternal return out of the notebook of Nietzsche himself were consummating into reality. The more bizarre was it in that I had no previous memory of these events before, my feeling being that they had been erased, but apparently they had only been locked away in some vault deep within my unconscious mind, only to bubble up to the surface at this most inopportune moment as I lay at the edge of a cliff, struggling for my very life. But despite the struggle of me against the ground, where my body was moving in an unstoppable fashion towards the edge, at the same time I was back in the car, driving, listening to the stereo, smelling the old familiar smells of that car, the odor of the dog we used to have's fur, the smell of the baby's spilled formula from that time the bottle came unscrewed on a road trip, my wife's stale perfume, the smell of an old pissed-up car seat, etc. It was all so real, so actual, as I watched the landscape advance and recede, as I swerved around corners on the country road, watching the daylight gradually fade away. But the smell most familiar that I did now notice was the whiskey. It was my own breath. And I noticed a wet spot down the front of my shirt and on the seat between my legs where I'd just spilled it. I watched as the flask came to my lips again before being set down in the center console once more next to my cell phone. "Effing bitch!" I heard myself shout in a sudden eruption of anger seemingly out of nowhere. As I heard these words, more context and more memories began to return to me. The real reason I was driving out into the sticks to cover this story. It was that I was in trouble at the office. I'd begun stepping out behind my wife's back with the girlfriend of one of my oldest friends who worked there. We'd met at one of the office parties. She was so drunk, and so was I. Everyone else was so tame, so boring. My wife had decided to leave that party early, telling me to be home within the hour when I insisted on staying. I'd called her a cab and even walked her down and opened the door for her. "Don't wait up," I'd slurred as I waved at the cab, watching it disappear down the street. I tried to walk back up to the party, but she caught me in the stairwell. "You seem like the only one around here that knows how to have a little fun," I remember her saying as she held up a small bag of white powder. We left together that night. That night ended in a wild spree. But that had been only the beginning of my spiral into the abyss of pleasure and forbidden desires. I began meeting her on my lunch hour, dipping out of the office, and even after work, telling my wife I'd have to stay late, or that I was driving down to this or that location for another story. Not only was my wife growing suspicious, but my friends too had noticed, and after all, it probably wasn't long before they knew what was happening, and only lacked the proof. And when we were finally caught in the office while I was supposedly burning the midnight oil there, caught by none other than my own supervisor, that was when things came to a head. My performance had been suffering, and now I'd brought unimaginable scandal into the small papers inner circle. I was given the terms and conditions that had to be satisfied to continue my employment there. I'd have to stop seeing her directly, obviously. I'd have to sober up. Yeah, I'd be moved into another desk on the opposite side of the building. Okay. My friend was junior to me, and he'd never become part of the old boys club as I had. They informed me that he wouldn't be notified of what happened, but that I had to keep my distance from now on, and I'd be given one last story to prove myself, that I was worth keeping around, that I could change things, that I could turn this damn thing around. That story had been the Mogakes. And so there I found myself driving the backcountry roads and venting to the bottle on my way to the one story that could save my career and my marriage. The one story that could turn everything around and put the brakes on this downward spiral. That was until I fell asleep. Until my headlights crossed the double yellow line, until the car swerved around the corner, until the head-on collision on the reservation. I felt the pain in my legs and in my skull, so fresh, so real, as if it were all occurring again for the very first time. Once the world stopped spinning, I could see the passengers in the other car over the crumpled hood. The man who'd been driving had his head down on the steering wheel. His hair appeared to be soaked with blood. A young woman was in the passenger seat, unconscious. But from my vantage point, it looked as if she were still breathing. I watched as I tried in vain to free my legs from the crushed front interior of my car. And then watched as I reached for the cell phone and in a panic dialed a number and hit send. But it wasn't 911. It was Detective Donovan of the State Police Force. Yes, now I remembered that Donovan had been a real detective, that he had owed me some favors, big ones from our past work together. The story on corruption, drug trafficking, and the involvement of his division that I had buried. When Donovan showed up alone, he checked out the scene before coming over and opening my door. He stared me up and down silently, shining his flashlight into my eyes. "Yeah, got yourself into something big this time, I see. You'll be alright. As for them, well, he's dead. Her, she's still breathing. She smells like booze. Guessing he was the designated driver. Watch this old trick. I'll take care of you, buddy. But it's gonna be you that owes me now. Remember that." He proceeded to drag first the man and then the woman out of the car and place them into each other's seats. When he returned, he said, "She won't remember a thing judging by that scrape on her head. She'll cop to driving. Trust me, I know how these things work. She'll wake up with no memory in the hospital, handcuffed to the bed. She'll cop to anything when she learns the charge is manslaughter. But that leaves the only loose end, you. You and your drunk, stinking ass over here in this car. I gotta call in a favor for this one. I'll take you into the hospital myself. Just a second." He reached over me, grabbing my flask, and walked around the vehicle to where the girl now lay back in the driver's seat. I watched him uncap the flask and pour, wipe off the neck of it with his shirt, and hold it to the girl's lips before pouring it out onto her shirt and dropping it inside the car. That was the last thing I remembered. I must have truly gone unconscious from the pain at that point. When I'd awoken in the hospital, I'd learned that it had been 2 young hoppies who'd been out partying. The girl had been found to be slightly over the legal limit. The man had nothing in his system. It seemed Donovan had somehow had the report state the accident had occurred just outside the reservation in his jurisdiction. I could never figure that one out, but I knew he had friends in high places. And now I lay at the edge of the cliff, the full recollection of events having returned, my lawsuit, the girl's prison sentence, the big check I'd gotten, all up to the present day where I now stared at Donovan's crushed and bloodied body at the base of the cliff. Full night had now fallen. Only the wan light of the moon and the embers of the smoldering fire lit the surroundings. After much time of reflection, it seemed this spell had broken. I was now once again in control of myself. I wasn't going to throw myself down after old Donovan. I slowly managed to lift myself up into a standing position. The night had grown so terribly cold. I paused by the embers of the fire, holding my hands close and rubbing them together in an attempt to quell the shivering of my body. As if the warmth of those embers had suddenly ignited some instinctual flame within me, I knew in that moment what it was that I needed to do. My Myuu had been forever lost and committed to these flames. My child had been taken by unknown persons to parts unknown. One of my oldest co-conspirators had been killed, and now it was my turn to take control of the situation, to exert my primeval survival instincts, to punish the offenders, to dominate them, to make them pay dearly. Once inside, I rummaged through the kitchen for the razor-sharp chef's knives we kept in one of the drawers. I then made my way back up the stairs in search of my cell phone, which I had long neglected to think of in my state of sheer panic. But there it was on the bed where I'd left it, despite the rest of the house having been ransacked. I quickly picked it up and was on the verge of dialing my wife when instead another sort of urge compelled me to stop. Instead, I found myself dialing the number of my contact on the Hopi reservation. I sat bent over in an excruciating attempt to slow down and control my breathing. I was damp with a cold sweat and shivering slightly as the warm air of the cabin began to thaw my bones and my whole being began to slowly condense and resolve into a recognizable human form once more. I listened to the phone ring several times, expecting that at each one I'd be flipped to the voicemail. But after a long while, after more rings than should have normally rang, I heard a clicking noise and then the sound of someone breathing. I sat impatiently in silence, waiting for the person on the other end of the line to question me. But they did not. I couldn't take it. I knew they were messing with me. I broke the silence first. "Hello? Hello? I can hear you. Who am I speaking with?" Again, all I could hear was the heavy breathing, unaltered on the other end. "Do you know who you're messing with? I've got powerful friends, very powerful friends with dark souls. Donovan? Nothing. People that owe me their livelihoods. You won't get away with this. Just wait till I call in a few favors. But it doesn't have to be like this. Just bring my daughter back to me. That's all I'm asking. Just bring her back and I'll forget this ever happened. I'll cover for you about Donovan. I know nothing about it. I'll push his car over the cliff. It'll look like an accident. We can work this out. I just need you to listen to reason, because if we can't work this out, I shudder for what awaits you, and I, for one, don't want any more blood on my hands." I stopped short on that last phrase, as if it had stuck in my throat, had lodged there and prevented the further passage of air. I attempted to say more, to plead my case more convincingly, but yet, as hard as I might have tried, nothing more could occur. My voice could not be summoned. It was at this moment I heard the first whispering of something on the other end. It sounded far, terribly far away from the receiver. But as I strained my ear, I recognized the unmistakable sound of quiet laughter. What one might describe as a snickering, a derisive, mocking variety, which portrays no sign of joy. My heart sunk with the knowledge that it was slowly growing louder over the line. I made to hang up the call, but I found myself rather glued to the spot, unable to move in some kind of anticipatory temporary paralysis. The pitch and intensity of that laughter continued to grow until it seemed to drown out the world around me and consume my whole consciousness, becoming the central focal point of my awareness. But just as I reached that consummate moment where I thought I would be eaten, digested, and shit out by it, it died on the vine. It was replaced by strange, warped-sounding patterns of speech of a dialect I was wholly unfamiliar with, which came across the wire with such deadly rapidity that my instant lack of understanding struck such terror into my very soul that my arm immediately threw the phone against the wall with all my might, shattering it. However, the sound continued to echo within my skull for a moment, simply a minor nuisance tormenting me. However, as the sound sunk in deeper, the familiar pain in my skull, exactly that which I had felt when staring at that strange symbol written in the dirt, returned. As the pain sunk in deeper, a fleeting thought, that of my college days studying Wittgenstein's Tractatus, flashed through my mind. He wanted to define the limitations of language and thought. But what I had just heard over the phone seemed to shatter this. Maybe concerning ordinary language such critique is warranted, but what the Mogake had spoken over the phone seemed to be without limitations of any kind, without form or containment specifically. As I removed my hands from my eyes where they had been applying an extreme amount of pressure, as if doing so would prevent my head from exploding, I noticed they were covered with a red, slimy liquid. I stumbled across the room and entered into the half bathroom, flipping on the light switch. In a panic, I moved to the mirror and inspected my face. Blood was streaming from my eyes, from my nose, from my ears. I watched as my eyes appeared to stand still in my reflection, no matter which direction I looked. I then felt a strange sensation against my tongue. My fingers instinctively moved to my mouth, whereupon half a dozen of the teeth spilled out into my hand, including the incisors and canines, followed by a deluge of blood. I would have screamed in that moment, except that the song, which harrows my soul to this very moment and drives me into a suicidal mania, had just become audible. It started as a low humming sound and gradually increased in intensity, similar to that laughter I had heard upon the phone not long before. I could sense the source of the sound was coming from down the stairs, that someone was standing at my door, with purposes unknown, singing a dirge in a tongue quite foreign to me, but which my sinking heart knew must be that same dialect I had heard only moments before. Less than a song, but more of a warlike chant did I identify as the moments grew on. I stumbled into the hallway, holding my hand over my bleeding mouth. The sound grew louder to the tone of a war cry. Somehow I could sense that warlike figure. I could observe him without, as if through the solid bulwark of the heavy pine door. I could sense him only as a silhouette. I saw the bow. I saw him pull the string back. I saw him let loose, and then I heard the arrow whizzing past my head, taking off my left ear and part of my cheek with it. My hand moved quickly to the new site of searing pain. My trembling fingers felt the location where flesh and muscle were located only moments ago, but where now slimy sinew and bone were only felt. The arrow had come through the solid pine of the door. I could see no damage to the door, no possible entryway for the arrow, and yet as I turned around, there it was, the feathered rod deeply speared into the wall behind me, as if it had never passed through anything more inhibitory than thin air. It was only gradually that I came to understand that the space within the cabin, the proportions, the dimensions, all were in flux around me. The door to the bedroom, which in memory should have been a dozen feet behind me to the right, was suddenly orthogonal to me and then eventually off to my left at some distance. The rest of the features of the house began also to shift, keeping no definite relation to one another, as if the house itself were doing some kind of fire dance to the warlike chants and hoots that echoed within its chambers. Everything at once began flickering. The stairs in front of me were still there, were still a simple set of stairs, but at once they were also a solid, impenetrable wall, and then a window whereupon the moonlight shone in. And in this respect, it wasn't a sequence of changes, but literally had taken on all of these characteristics at the same time, simultaneously. One object had become many. The whole structure around me began to creak, as if from the strain of its gyrations. It was gradually taking on a staticky, noisy, blinking character, as if it threatened to change state somehow precipitously, dramatically, perhaps in some way sublimating into vapor. I stepped forward hesitatingly and then backward again, not knowing what would become of me if I entered into one of those areas of the cabin that had taken on a multiplicity, which is the best description I can come up with. Would I instantly be torn into a multiplicity, my bodily form being fractured, taking on some extended and splintered form as if viewed through a kaleidoscope, much like language was by the fall of Babel itself? It dawned on me then that the language I now heard, filling my home in my ears, so alien sounding to me like a form of demonic tongues, was likewise ripping me apart from the inside, just like it was the house. I was now hearing things which cannot be expressed in my native language of English, or any other modern language for that matter. What was being expressed was something of the beginning, when the world was full of chaos and God's shadow floated over the face of the waters, before the first word had been spoken, before the first name was given a thing by God and then man. This was a language which could describe the primordial state of those things which predated God, the prime mover himself. Those creatures older than the sphere which we called the universe, I had the feeling the Mogake were somehow intimately connected with in ways that defied my comprehension, I am sure from now and to my dying day. As I clutched my stomach, it felt as if something were seething within there, as if what was occurring to the house was now indeed happening to my organs within. I felt blood trickling down my leg, from what orifice I didn't dare dream to hypothesize. I imagined the cells of the intestines, kidney, and liver all melting and oozing, intermixing together until no separate forms existed, but only a strange, pulsating, gelatinous blend, consisting of all cell types like a patchwork quilt. Whilst mortal terror did overwhelm me, this was motivating enough to get my crippled legs moving. I flung myself forwards, not even bothering to attempt to go gracefully into the night. I found myself somersaulting down a few stairs before merely going into a free fall that seemed much longer than one story. I hit the floor hard and, as it were, just in time, for as I looked up at the location where I had just been standing on the second floor, there appeared a man who stood well in excess of 6 feet tall. He looked to be in his 40s, his face dark, stoic, and battle-scarred. His long black hair flowed down over his shoulders. I could see the bow strapped to his back, and a hatchet was held high in his hand, as if he had been just about to strike at the back of me, right before I had taken this leap of almighty faith. I was on my feet again, but just as quickly he vanished like a flash of light. I was out the door within seconds and halfway across the field. As I looked back at the cabin, it appeared to be oscillating at a great angle from one side to the other. I heard the great splintering thunder of logs being torn asunder. The light through the windows was flickering, it now appearing as if the windows were blinking eyes, the gaping door a great mouth, as if the cabin itself had become animate. A flashback to the office and the old editor before my fateful trip to the reservation. So long ago, he leaned over my desk and told me that the Mogake were rumored to have the belief that all things, all forms in this world were actually animate, that you could get their secrets, that you could speak to them and create an understanding as it were, but it only took the right language, the right words to do so. A great blinding light suddenly illuminated all the cabin and blinded me where I stood, as if a massive ball of lightning were traveling through the halls and rooms of the house. The clearing erupted with a thunderous roar as every log and every board which made the structure was torn into infinitely many splinters, the entire mass precipitately sinking into the earth. A great flash of light, which seemed to me like a star exploding, then came as the earth closed in over the whole of it. The last thing I remember was a great gust of wind and tremors beneath me like a shockwave that sent me hurtling through the air into a most concrete and utter darkness. When I finally came to, my head was splitting. I was still enveloped by the darkness of night. That was the only clear thing. But as I gazed up at the starless sky, my instincts told me that dawn was close. It took me a long while, what might have been hours, before I was able to rouse myself, me drifting in and out of consciousness for some time. When I finally gained enough resolve and courage against the pain, I lifted myself into a kneeling position on all fours and looked around. The cabin was gone, but I still saw Detective Donovan's car parked precisely where he had left it. I sighed a great sigh of despair, mixed with relief, as I remembered the old woman who had disappeared into the woods earlier. She had surely saved my daughter's life. For that much I felt grateful. But there was something else wrong with the scene around me. Some distance off in front of Donovan's car, there was another car parked. I recognized it as my wife's SUV. No, I muttered to myself as I rose to my feet. I began stumbling towards the vehicles, but I was so far away, 100 yards at least, and my legs were now more disabled than ever, like rubber bands capable of nothing other than feeling excruciating pain. As I progressed, the dawn light began to emerge, and I could see the whole of the area more clearly. I could see the fire pit, which was behind what used to be the cabin and beyond to the edge of the cliff. And there, near the edge, stood two figures. Only they weren't standing, but advancing towards the edge at a good clip. One was facing towards me and moving backwards as if being forced by the other. It was my wife. The other, the warrior, went with his bow stretched taut. "No!" I cried into the air, utterly helpless, as I tried to run but felt my body as if it were moving through a pit of molasses. I saw the bowstring fly. I heard a loud thumping noise. I watched as her body went limp. I watched as she tumbled backwards over the cliff. Then there was only one standing there. He turned towards me, but it seemed he had no facial features, only darkness. That was when I lost consciousness again. If you are reading this in earnest, as someone willing to give the benefit of the doubt, then please hear me out. Everything recorded here is what happened, exactly as it happened. Always remember that this is what happened on that night. Even many years from now, remember that this is what happened on that night. Don't believe what you read in the papers or from YouTube pundits. They never get things right. Just between you and I, they can't separate the fact from surmise, which is the journalist's mighty calling. I was once a great journalist. I was really good at this thing. And for an even shorter time, I was a great writer. Although my Ululume will never see the light of day, it did shine brightly within my mind, at least living as a spark which lives only to be marvelous once, experienced once, and then extinguished. I now sit on the edge of the cliff, writing this the old-fashioned way, pen and paper. These are the facts relevant to the case. When I awoke, there was no sign of a native warrior. When I awoke, the cabin was there, as it always had been, as it should have been. When I awoke, Donovan's car and my wife's car were also there, next to the cabin. When I awoke, there was no sign of the baby. When I awoke, I looked over the edge of this cliff, which I now stand on. There was Donovan. There was my wife. However, the arrows had vanished. But also do not forget the most relevant facts of all, which are those that precede this paragraph. All are the truth, none are falsehoods, none are fantastical dreams, none are hallucinations. I assure you this is the truth and the whole truth. So help me God. Now as I determine what will be next for me, which is for me alone to decide, whether I will wait for the sirens to come, or whether I will catapult myself over the edge, your job, dear reader, is to decide the truth for yourself. That's your job, your responsibility, to assimilate all the facts and to determine just what the hell is going on here. And if you do figure it out, if you do have some great revelation, and if you hear that I am still on this mortal coil, please, please, oh please come find me and let me know just what it is. Let me know what is this darkness that has now consumed me, my life, my everything. Goodbye for now.